drawn from the democratic process can be considered legitimate under the principle of democratic centralism. Once a decision is democratically reached, all of us as members of the organization are bound to respect and uphold it as a collective mandate. We are not here at the Third National People's Assembly because we have no other task. We are here because ideologically we are obligated to do so. Internal democracy is sacrosanct, and without it, we are doomed to follow the path of fascism. There is no single individual who possesses so much revolutionary wisdom that they can assume leadership responsibility without a democratic mandate. We must defend the principle, fighters without any doubt that we are ideologically correct. There is no genuine revolution that can be led outside of a revolutionary and socialist democracy, not bourgeois democracy, but people's democracy. If you doubt democracy because it has potential to be corrupted, then consider if a collective can be corrupted, what makes you think an individual cannot be corrupted? We must never surrender a people's organization to the whims of an individual. It is for this reason, comrades, that all issues we have proposed in the public domain are open for discussion, agreement, and disagreement here at this National People's Assembly. We have diagnosed that we need to establish sub-regional structures and possibly do away with regional structures so that our movement and its leaders emerge organically from where they reside and lead their own communities. I wish to make emphasis that I feel very strong about this point. It is part of our organizational experience that the regional structures in the EFF are not fit for purpose. This reflects an error in organizational design inherited from the former liberation movement, which we must now do away with. Additionally, we have proposed that we establish an EFF Youth Command and do away with the EFF Student Command so that we may appeal to all the youth of South Africa. The gift of democracy is that this NPA will resolve on this question, and no single individual has the right to impose their will on anyone. Compatriots, internal democracy does not mean weakness or the absence of decisive leadership, which we are often accused for. The West has a tendency to create the impression that one of the problems confronting the continent and liberation movement is that of authority. The notion is that the absence of authority leads to freedom and prosperity, and that all attempts at running communist and socialist states have failed primarily due to the so-called authoritarian character of their leadership. President Robert Mugabe, brother leader Muammar Gaddafi, Captain Thomas Sankara, Commandant Fidel Castro, President of the People's Republic of China, and the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, and President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, are all accused of being authoritarian, as though the West is governed by the most democratic of ideas. Put differently, it is as though democracy itself lacks authority. Authority refers to the imposition of the will of one sector of society onto another. In democracy, authority refers to the will of the majority prevailing over the few. Authority is ever present. For any system to function, there must be a command from superior to subordinate. To demonize authority within the revolution, within the context of our war against capitalism, is either ignorant or a deliberate attempt to sow confusion. What liberal thinkers fail to understand is the hypocritical critique of authority is that authority exists under all economic and political systems, even in capitalism thrives through authority. Capitalism survives because the state which currently exists to protect the interest of the capitalist class operates with the authority of the monopoly on violence. Authority refers to the system, hierarchy, and legitimacy conferred by the people or bought by money and state violence in the case of capitalism. As socialists, we are engaged in a war against the most perverse global economic system known to humankind. The absence of authority in our revolution is a guarantee of failure. The West wants us to lack authority so that we become chaotic and disorganized. We must never allow our enemies to define us. We must always subject ourselves to the authority of leadership, a leadership that draws its legitimacy from the masses, not to reactionary and liberal definition of democracy, which strip the revolution of its existence. As Marxists, we seek the authority of the poor and the working class who do not own the means of production, to surpass that of the bourgeoisie. Marxism teaches us that the working class must destroy the authority of capitalism, which thrives on private property, profit-driven economies, and the concentration of wealth in the hands of the few. In simple terms, as Marxists, we believe in the authority of the people over the means of production, not the authority of the bourgeoisie over the people and the economy. So, no one commissars and fighters has any ideological basis to call the EFF authoritarian. The very capitalist system we live under thrives through authority, and it is the authority of the few. We must expect an aggressive onslaught from captains of industry and their media puppets. We have seen this especially since we celebrated a decade of existence at FNB Stadium, where we united more than 120,000 people under one roof as a symbol of common purpose and unity we share as a movement. There will be attempts to discredit our achievement as non-existent and disruptive. This is because the agenda is to undermine that which capital does not control. Our duty is to expose this and be consistent in our message that the EFF remains the only incorruptible and uncaptured organization capable of delivering socialism in our lifetime. Chairs, fighters and compatriots, one of our defining ideological features is our commitment to the ideals of Frantz Fanon. There are two aspects of Fanon's work that we must re-emphasize, which must always guide us whenever we seek to understand our role in the post-colonial world. Two chapters of particular significance are from his book, The Wretched of the Earth, The Pitfalls of National Consciousness and on Violence. The chapters are significant because one provides guidance on why liberation movement fail post-liberation, and the other diagnoses the necessity of violence and the inherent violence existing in a colonial and neo-colonial society. If we want to learn from the mistake of those who came before us, Fanon is instructive. He tells us what not to do and what not to become. The problem we confront internally as Africans is the persistence of liberation movement that sustain themselves on blackmail and through the use of law enforcement agencies to suppress the people's demands for the promises of liberation. Most recently, the liberation movement here in South Africa, when faced with getting rid of itself, aligned with our historical enemies in characterizing the EFF as a threat to the nation, because when ideas are lost, blackmail and surf become the strategy. We are told that if the EFF is in government, it will be a doomsday for the people of South Africa. Fanon teaches and illustrates that liberation movements have no potential to lead us into the future. They are preoccupied with reminding our people of the past during every election cycle and periodically through meaningless celebration of so-called Independence Day. These movements are led by a class of triumphalist politicians who resent the masses and categorize them as ungrateful for the leadership of the liberation movement. The former liberation movement began to build a wall between itself and the masses while impatiently accumulating petty wealth in alliance with the West. Fanon's lessons are important because he shows us how post-liberation national leadership reconstitutes itself as a mediator of capitalist interests, turning the nation into a brothel for imperialists. Fanon reveals that this decay in the relationship between the people and the liberation movement create a political class that no longer relates to the people. This political class loses sight of the continued poverty of the masses and its inability to reconstruct society away from the grip of colonialism. Because of this, the former colonizer tightened its grip over the resources of the former colony through concessions, loans, and other mechanisms that entrenches our underdevelopment and dependency on the West. The national bourgeoisie, also underdeveloped to lead strategic sectors of the economy, turns back to the colonialist and relies on the protection and support of Europeans. Their failure led to the collapse of not only the nation, but also the liberation movement itself. This is what the EFF must always guard against as our presence increases in governance and places of political influence. We must not resent our people because they do not vote for us, even though we fight bitterly for their dignity. We must resist the temptation of crumbs of imperialism, crumbs imperialists leave for the political class, and never forget the genuine purpose of our struggle for liberation. We must avoid accumulating so much personal wealth that the hunger of our people for land, jobs, education, and decent life becomes nothing but slogans we chant to celebrate ourselves. Our reflection on more than a decade of selfless struggle for economic freedom in our lifetime must not become a parade of self-praise or a tool to immobilize our people. It must serve as an occasion to renew our passion and commitment to liberating our people. Fanon writes painfully, I quote, "After a few years, the breakup of the party becomes obvious, and any observer, even the most superficial, can notice that the party, today the skeleton of its former selves, only served to immobilize the people. The party, which during the battle had drawn itself the whole nation, is now falling apart. The party is becoming a means of private advancements." Close quote. We must hold Fanon's prophecy close to our hearts to ensure that the economic emancipation movement fulfills its strategic mission for economic freedom in our lifetime. Comrades, these are internal contradictions we must avoid to ensure that we do not betray the mandate of liberation. This is a self-reflective diagnosis that we must internalize as we enter a second decade of struggle, so we do not use our history of resistance or the external pressure of imperialism as an excuse to avoid accountability to the revolutionary expectations of our people or to interest self-interest and corruption. The second of Fanon's insight that we must hold close to our heart is his assertion that decolonization is always a violent phenomenon. This is critical for a militant organization like ours, because we are tasked with reawakening the consciousness of a society convinced of the possibility of reconciliation without justice. The EFF exists in a country indoctrinated to believe that the contradictions between the African black majority and the white capitalist ruling class can be resolved peacefully, and that violence in any form must be avoided and condemned. This belief is simply untrue. We must explain this truth to our people. When the South African Human Rights Commission takes us to court for saying that ultimately our revolution will require us to kill, we must be prepared to contextualize what we mean. When the Human Rights Commission and the racist lobby group take us to court for declaring that we are in a war with white supremacy, we must be able to explain to our people what black consciousness is and why it cannot coexist with the idea that white people are inherently superior and one of the two must die. Fanon is important here because he gives us the tools to explain to our people that the conditions within which they live are violent. It is violence to segregate African people into underdeveloped townships and villages without services. It is violence for a white minority to have complete control over the means of production in Africa. It is violence that the majority of the land remains in the hands of a white minority. Colonialism is institutional and structural violence, and reversing it requires violence. Changing legislation to allow for land expropriation without compensation is a form of organized violence against the white supremacy, but this violence is rooted in justice. Our message is simple. There cannot be unity and reconciliation in South Africa without justice, and justice will be violent for those who are comfortable at the expense of African people. Ultimately, there will be a need to take up arms, as this is the eventual outcome of all struggles against injustice met with resistance. This conclusion arises because the white capitalist class feels entitled to the wealth and resources they accumulated through crime and will violently defend their right to exploit and oppress African people. In the face of this arrogance, violence is inevitable. This is what we must coherently and logically explain to our people. Decolonization questions the colonial situation, casts into doubt, and makes the native an active participant in reshaping the world order. Decolonization is a substitution and radical reorganization of society wherein the last shall be first and the first shall be last. As Fanon tells us, this process demands that we prepare for violence at any stage because it is impossible to transform society born out of and sustained by violence without violence itself. Colonialism was born from the blood, suffering, slavery, destruction of Africans and African identity. Without the violent subjugation of Africans, the colonial system ceased to exist. Our people being denied education is violence. Our people living in shacks is violence. Our people working in mines for little wages while enriching global capitalists is violence. The erasure of our history is violence. The fact that labor such as domestic work, gardening, and security services are reserved for Africans in service to white people is violence. The fact that a white child's first encounter with an African is often as a servant is violent. The entire existence of Africans is imagined through the eyes of the colonizer. And to radically change this and reimagine ourselves through our own eyes and tradition will be a violent process. Fanon's concepts of the two zones of reality, where the town of the European is filled with tarred roads and lies, while the lands of the native is filled with poverty and overcrowding, perfectly describes South Africa's violent social and economic situation today, which must be transformed. These are the realities we must explain to our people. We must show them how abnormal their situation is so that the prospects of violence does not offend them. Our people must never be offended by violence because their very existence is a manifestation of violence. Commissars and fighters, alongside internal contradictions, we must consider the external challenges that threaten the revolutionary project for African independence. These challenges are posed by imperialism and neocolonialism. Many liberal thinkers like to credit the failures and collapse of African states to the leadership style of African leaders, blaming socialist and anti-imperialist policies. Imperialist and so-called governance experts argue that African economies fail because independent states resist the anarchy of the markets, constantly calling for increased privatization as a solution to our economic problems. By anarchy of the markets, we mean the capitalist class and its proponents want democratically elected states to allow policy direction and economies to be dictated by invisible hand known as the independent market. This market downgrades and rates economies based on whether they are investor-friendly according to their narrow political, social, and economic preferences. The market manipulates prices and encourages collusion by the private sector to maximize profits regardless of the impact on ordinary people. This capitalist madness, which ignores the basic needs of the people, is a breeding ground as an authoritarianism. Imperialist nations propagate these arguments to mask their role in Africa's underdevelopment and to legitimize capitalist hegemony. They assume that the only valid form of governance is Western-oriented authority, while attacking non-Western systems as inherently flawed. As Marxists, we must understand that our problems are from global capitalism and its advanced manifestation, imperialism. To dismantle this system, we must first understand Marxism, the concept of authority, and why global capitalism mobilizes itself against alternative ways of organizing the economy. Delegates, another question we must respond to and reflect on is the question of unity. Fighters, there has been a much debate and discussions across our nation about the cause of black unity and unity amongst the progressive forces. As part of the preparations for this Third National People's Assembly, we were questioned by our own branches as to what constitutes a progressive forces. We must have a coherent response to our own branches as to what continues to motivate certain alliances we have in society. But for the interest of defining our political moment, we must define what characterizes the progressive left in South Africa. To merely say you are progressive does not mean you are progressive. To merely state that you are on the left or that you are black conscious does not make you leftist or black conscious. To belong to these categories is proven through action, through ideological persuasion, through practice. Black unity has always been imperative in South Africa, but blackness should not be used as a shield for opportunism or to escape one's own wrongdoing. The disparate need for black solidarity must not be taken advantage of by individuals who manipulate the black identity to avoid accounting for how they have jeopardized the cause of black liberation. There are forces in South Africa today who have discovered the cause of black unity after they previously undermined it while they were in power, and this discovery is manipulative. You, as delegate, must ask yourself, while the so-called new leaders of black unity were sitting as state president and even justified the killing